Vi följer hennes liv i med- och motgång i dokumentärserien Enastående kvinnor ikväll klockan 20. Vi har läst och hört om det allt oftare, dödsskjutningarna i amerikanska skolor. Vad är det som driver en person till en sån handling? Kvällens dokumentär söker svaret.
.7 millimeter short magnum. It's great for hunting out west. This is a 12-gauge pump shotgun made by Remington. Excellent firearm.
Americans have been armed and kind of nuts for the last 200 years. It doesn't answer the question, why did it start in post offices in 1986? Why did it go to the workplace in the end of the 80s, early 90s? Why did it go into schools?
There's a huge number of suburban youth who are armed out there who at any point could end up pulling the trigger. Part of understanding them is just simply the availability of guns and the gun culture in the U.S.
America's always had guns. It's supposedly in our Constitution, depending on how you interpret the Second Amendment. So it enables it. It helps make it easier for more shootings to take place. But calling it the root cause is just blindness.
Emergency. We need a ambulance, please. A guy just killed himself and killed another employee at Atlanta's Plastic.
Okay, sir. Is he still there?
Well, they're dead.
Oh, okay, both of them are.
Yes.
Okay, is the address there?
Address to 911. I just called about a shooting at Atlanta's Plastic. Yes, sir. I said it was 2 people. Yes, sir. But I believe it's more than 2. It's some more in the break room. So, okay. Is the weapon secured? Where's the weapon? Well, the boy who done the shoot, he shot himself. He's laying there. The weapon's beside him, I think. Okay, keep everybody away from the area. Okay? All right, all right. Control units responding. We may have more than 2. We also have some in the break room.
A 14-year-old freshman with a handgun opened fire on the students gathered for prayer.
Joseph Westbecker, age 47, of Louisville, a longtime employee of Standard Reviewer.
If Williams is tried as an adult, he could get 500 years in prison.
Do you know of any places where he's worked that he's had a incident where he's threatened other coworkers or supervisors?
This time, it was a 27-year-old graduate student who carried his weapons in a guitar case.
Saw him with a gun and saw him shoot himself.
Police say the shooter carried 5 stolen weapons to school. 2 rifles, 2 shotguns.
911, where's your emergency?
Located on the river. It's relatively quiet, friendly town.
Books, backpacks, and blood mark the hall where the 14-year-old freshman with a handgun opened fire on the students gathered for prayer. 14-year-old Nicole Hadley, 15-year-old Casey Steger, and 17-year-old Jessica James were killed.
I actually remember a lot from that morning. The very first girl gets shot in the head. And I remember standing there looking at her thinking, this is just a joke. This isn't real. This couldn't happen here.
I heard this noise and I thought, oh, great. Somebody shot firecrackers off in the lobby. So I came out the door, and when I did, there was a massive rush of kids coming down the hall.
After 3 slow pops, I remember there was a huge spray of bullets after that, and I was shot in the spray of bullets.
Missy was here, so I came down to her, and her sister was there. And so I talked to her and said, Missy, are you okay?
I couldn't feel my stomach. I couldn't feel my legs. I knew I was paralyzed.
But now Jessica James, she was conscious when we first got to her. And she began to have seizures and shake. And so I left Missy and came over here and stayed with her. We found a bullet hole. She had been shot right here. And I can remember thinking, oh, great, she's going to be okay.
It was almost 11:30 or 12 o'clock before they stopped surgery on her. She was losing a lot of blood. I don't know exactly how many units of blood, but we had a friend that worked back there, and he was talking about, that they were holding units of blood in their hand and squeezing them, just trying to keep her blood pressure up, and just one bag after another after another.
We never know when the Lord's going to call us home. Our children are a gift to us. And God doesn't say he's going to let us keep them forever.
Casey Steger was back here in the hallway. The pirate was not here at the time. And Casey, she never gained consciousness.
I saw Michael standing against the wall, and I thought, you've got to get that gun before he changes clips. As I moved towards him, he just laid the gun down. I didn't say anything. There's no eye contact. It's not like it is on television. All I could see is that gun.
After he was done shooting, I remember thinking, I can't believe it was Michael. And I was so confused and thinking, why did he do this?
And your date of birth?
June 1st, 1983.
And that makes you
14.
I met him in the hallway, and he had a blanket, duct tape on the ends of it. And I asked him what it was. He told me it was a project for school. And then he pulled some earplugs out of his pocket, put them in his ears. And I asked him if he was going to wear those for first period and, you know, block the teacher out.
I remember putting the earplugs in. I heard in my head that I had better do it because, you know, time was running out. And I kept hearing these different things in my head. And now's the time, do it now. I really wasn't doing much thinking of my own. I was more just scared, and I hate to say listening to what I was hearing in my head, but that's pretty much what it was.
I think the mental instability is a huge factor, but we have to understand why it unfolds the way it does in this particular form, because there are, sadly, many people who suffer from grave mental disorders that don't ever shoot anyone. So the question is why this intersection of someone with a mental disorder that ends up in a shooting, and it's the confluence of the social setting and the individual's problems that produces this pattern. But I do think it's relevant. Completely normal people don't shoot people. It is an intersection of a mental disorder, which in the young shooters is in its very early stages, where there's tremendous shame and sensitivity among the shooters about how marginal they are, how disturbed they're becoming.
I just know he wasn't himself that day, last time I talked to him.
I never saw any signs to me that I would have ever thought that he was mentally ill whatsoever.
I'm quite persuaded that he is severely disturbed, as are most of the shooters, but I can understand entirely why the victims don't think so. We don't know how to identify schizophrenics very easily at the age of 12 or 13 years old. Our diagnostic categories are set up for people in their 20s, and by the time they're in their 20s, these symptoms become quite florid.
We started talking about bringing a gun to school or something and taking over. And I guess...
Okay, you said we. Who's we?
Like me and Toby and Ace.
What I remember is that there was discussion among Michael Carneal and some of his friends of taking over the school. There were discussions that that would be a neat thing to do, at least among some of Michael Carneal's friends.
We watched a movie called The Basketball Diaries. And in one scene, he pulled a gun out of his trench coat and shot kids. And he said, man, I'd like to do that to some of them kids that pick on me. And I just snickered. I didn't want to reprimand him for saying that. You know, he didn't be getting an argument or anything. So like I say, I'm just let things roll off my back. And that was the end of that. We're just two kids sitting on the couch.
Films by themselves don't make people kill anybody, but films and books help to define what's seen as positive and alluring, in this case, a kind of anti-hero image. It's important to understand that the school shooters are not shooting off at random. They're not exploding without warning. They are planful. They have intended to do what they're doing. And what is their goal? Their goal is to change the way other people around them see them. It's to change their public image.
Toby was the only one that you really talked to about taking guns to school.
Yeah.
Did he know it was this day? Did anybody know it was this day?
No.
There might have been other kids that had talked about, yeah, that'd be fun to shoot the school up. That might have happened. But I don't think that there were any other kids that had made an emotional commitment to do it.
There was never sufficient evidence, never nearly sufficient evidence to charge anyone other than Michael Carneal.
Yes, we do have guns here. But we also teach, or we should be teaching, that when you fire a gun at somebody, it's permanent. And I don't believe with Michael Carneal he was ever taught that it was permanent. That's a failure of our society in the sense that maybe his neighbors didn't tell him, and maybe his father and his mother did not tell him.
I felt distant from my parents, but my home life, it was as perfect as I can possibly conceive a family being. It was just my dad, he worked 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, probably if that. My mom, she was a stay-at-home mom. It was just me and my sister. She made good grades, and she was always doing good.
His sister was a senior and was in Jessica's class, and of course she was in the band too.
I was pretty much stuck in it, regardless of how much I didn't want to be in it, but that's where a lot of the people who I considered friends were.
In the younger shooters in middle schools and high schools, it intersects a pecking order among teenagers that produces terrible feelings of despair in many teenagers, in thousands of them. They don't shoot people, but they do go through a great deal of depression.
People at school would say things, why don't you dress nice like your sister, and why don't you do this like your sister? So I had these strange feelings of just kind of alienation and left out. She was all-state in band and all-state in choir, and she was real popular, and she was a senior the year I was a freshman, so she was at the top of the food chain, you know, and I was at the very bottom.
The pecking order, the jockeying for social status, the desire to be accepted, the power of rejection among middle school children in particular is enormous, especially in American culture, but is well known around the world. And so when someone who is mentally unstable intersects this powerful pecking order and they don't succeed, they're marginal. And when, in addition to that, they're located in very small towns that are geographically removed from any kind of population center, the feeling of being stuck, isolated, and doing poorly in this tournament for social status intersects to produce this rampage pattern. Then you add to it the fact that these communities tend to be very stable, very stable. They're so stable that if you feel like you're on the losing end of a competition for status, you will always be there because nobody's moving out. In Michael Carneal's high school, only 3 people left that town to go to college in another community at the year that this shooting happened. And that was a pretty typical pattern. People are generally happy there and they stay there. But if you're not happy and you're not doing well and you don't think you're ever going to be able to leave this place, your marginality feels like a life sentence instead of a temporary experience that you'll escape when you're 18 and leave.
I don't have a clue now as to how many letters I wrote her or what I wrote in the letters.
I do think that he does feel terrible for what he did, you know, and he's told me sorry over and over again for what he's done to me. But I've never really heard him say that he's sorry for the shooting.
A reign of terror inside a Louisville printing plant. And moments later, a parade of innocent victims.
The toll, at least 8 dead, 13 wounded, 5 of them critically. The shooter, a worker on disability, quote, looking for bosses.
If you look at a link between school shootings and workplace shootings, you only have to go as far as the United States Secret Service report called the Safe School Initiative. And you say, why would they be interested in school violence? And their perspective is, what are the behaviors of a school perpetrator that we could learn about for people who want to attempt to assassinate public figures or who have engaged in similar behavior in the workplace? So what they've discovered certainly is that there are a number of parallels in school shooters to workplace violence perpetrators. And one of the biggest things that came out of the report is the presence of a third-party threat. The student who took a gun and shot a principal or another student or an ex-girlfriend or something like that did not tell the target, they told another person. This student made a third-party threat to a friend or another student about what they were going to do. And that was really significant from the Secret Service research, because the presence of these types of third-party threats was a significant warning sign, not only in the school violence piece, but also in the workplace violence studies as well.
The FBI and the Secret Service and all kinds of people have tried to come up with a profile for the type of person who would commit these going postal rampage massacres. And over they've failed. They've not been able to come up with a profile because it can be anybody, married, unmarried, could be white, could be African American, Hispanic. In school, it could be the outsider, nerdy kid, but there have also been plenty of really intelligent kids who've done pretty well. The only thing you know in these instances is that it's never the CEO or the very top person. It's never the most popular kid in the school. But the other 90% are all capable of it.
In the recent past for Louisville and Kentucky, been on a decline as far as industry is concerned. Through the years, the Courier-Journal and Standard-Gravure Corporation was one of the premier employers here. And I was very privileged to get a job there and make a very good living with a lot of wonderful people for a lot of years.
But this story is best told in numbers. 8 dead, 8 people dead, 14 sent to local hospitals. Among the dead, Joseph Westbecker, age 47, of Louisville, a longtime employee of Standard-Gravure who was on disability.
The losses were just too overwhelming. But I wondered if there was more that I could have done personally as the president of the union to help Joe to have avoided this. I don't know that there was, and I don't really, I guess, blame myself, but it's still in there.
I heard the elevator open. It was Joseph Westbecker. He walked off the elevator, and I just remember something very strange. He had a strange expression on his face, and Sharon said, "May we help you?" And he didn't respond. And he took another step, and she asked him again. And as she asked him the second time, he removed the gym bag with one arm off of his other arm, and the rifle was there, aimed at us already.
Inside the bag were 2 MAC-11 semi-automatic weapons and enough ammunition to keep killing for hours.
He dropped the bag and he began to fire across the room. I remember thinking, don't shoot me. I guess I hadn't realized that I had been shot at that point, but I remember thinking, don't shoot me, don't shoot me. And I lay very quietly. I had my eyes closed, but at some point I remember muttering, "Please don't shoot me, I have baby." And he turned around and slammed the door. And I never heard another sound after that for the longest time.
As Westbecker started down this hallway, he would set his satchel down a number of times and fire randomly as people poked their heads out of these office doorways.
I went to the other side, to a break room that we have, and had a cup of coffee and was reading the paper for a little while. And I looked around my shoulder, and the door was opening with a gun pushing it open. And then I started hearing the gunshot, pop, pop, pop. And then all of a sudden, it pop, pop, pop was me. 2 went through my thigh and didn't touch any bones. It just went through it. And then one of them went through my knee and splintered my knee. One touched my shin on the left side, just barely grazed it. And then I had one go from the back of my elbow through my arm and came out here at my wrist. And then one here that just touched, the bullet just touched my arm and it blew a place in it about that big.
The worst part was the break room, and that's where he ended up at, and that's where the most people were shot at and so forth. And I still distinctly remember he had shot in through a air conditioner and broke a water line, and that area was flooded. I distinctly remember different scenes still to this day of the one gentleman who was walking down the steps with his paper going to his locker and was shot and fell head down. His feet were still up on the steps. His head was at the bottom of the steps there.
At the beginning, Joe was a very nice man, and he changed. The first indication of Joe changing was when he got divorced.
He was a pretty ordinary guy until after this divorce, and he got remarried, and he was having a little trouble with his second wife also. So these things kind of affected him. They made him a little carefree, and at the same time laughable, because, you know, here's a guy thinks he's a teenager again. You know, they kind of teased him about it, but, you know, nothing out of the ordinary.
A former employee of the plant named Joseph Westbecker, while on Prozac, showed up with an AK-47 and opened fire.
20 of us felt that Prozac was a major cause of this deterioration in this guy's abilities. Prozac, you know, was in the guy. He was taking it, but he had stopped taking it, you know, a couple days before.
There's always been a percentage of the population that's mentally unbalanced, and a percentage of the population that has mental health issues. That's, you know, that's historically a fact, I think, that everyone would agree with. What's different is that people started shooting up their own workplace and their own schools at a specific time in a specific country. I thought at first that these killings were just random acts of crazy violence. It was sort of the new version of serial killers and Charlie Manson's. But over time, it became clear that the kind of people that were perpetrating these acts, especially as they spread from the workplace and then to schools in middle America, that these were kind of anybody. They weren't your typical psycho. And so I started to consider that actually maybe these weren't random acts of violence, but that they arose out of specific kind of cultural or socioeconomic conditions. And the most obvious thing that's changed is the American workplace.
Post office shooting, at least it looks like we have 4 down over off of 400 Stork. I need some North County units down here to do some coverage. I'm going to be using all my resources.
Going postal shootings, people shooting up their post offices one after another, and then shooting up their workplaces one after another. This did start at a specific time and place. It started in the mid-1980s, towards the end of the 80s, as the Reagan Revolution and Reaganomics really took hold and kind of changed the whole culture. And considering that Americans these days spend, you know, almost all their waking hours at work, in the office or wherever, the changes in the workplace can change people's lives and minds and their mental health and their physical health. And what's happened since Reagan came to power is that the workplace has become an incredibly brutal, unforgiving place that doesn't at all match with the cultural propaganda about life getting better and better.
Standard Revere actually was a wonderful place to work. I enjoyed my job very much. As long as it was owned by the Binghams, they were very generous owners. Unfortunately, after the Binghams, when the new owner took over, that was a rather terrible period to work there.
All of those people, gentlemen who worked in that area where the machines were at, all had injuries. They had burns from things that caught on fire. They had missing fingers. Every one of those gentlemen had had something happen during the time they were there. So I think that the safety record probably wasn't the best, and I think that was a consideration also for a lot of those people. I'm not sure if Westbecker thought that the vast cause of this was the new ownership, but it seemed to be when, you know, these things started deteriorating when the new ownership took over from the Binghams. I always believe his ultimate goal was getting to that break room and doing something to people that he actually worked with. And his supervisor, if he could find him, his supervisor wasn't there at the time.
I think you're dealing with somebody who decided that he was going to take everything down with him any way he could, destroy this company, destroy their means of making money. You know, it's just hard to believe that anybody would hate that many people. And I think most of us came to the conclusion that he was looking for the bosses.
By the time of the workplace massacre at Standard Gravure, the union was destroyed. The plant was pretty well destroyed. Workers made less at the end of the 80s than they made in the beginning of the 80s. And management behaved like the Mongol horde towards the workers, and one of them eventually snapped. He was consciously siding and influenced by the biggest post office massacres. He identified with the post office massacres, and he brought them to the private workplace. I think it's almost as if a new form of rebellion was born, and so it was inevitable that this tactic or something was going to be borrowed by other people.
Santee is what we in America would call a bedroom community. It is a suburb of a large city, so to speak. It's about 25 miles from the center of San Diego.
I was paralyzed from the neck down. I'd broken my neck in 3 places. I was paralyzed for 2 days, and I began walking slowly after that. It was a miracle. The bullet is so close to my brainstem that I shouldn't be here right now.
Hey, where's the shooter? He was in the boys' bathroom. He was in the boys' bathroom? How many people have been shot? My friend of mine has been shot. I think a few others have.
We got a radio call of a shooter at Santana High School in a boys' restroom. And as we got within view of the school, we could see all of these students just pouring out of the front entrances into the streets and across the streets. Inside the restroom, we saw 2 students who had been shot.
You want to sit in here, or do you want me to do what?
No, you can just hang out.
Okay.
Thanks.
I couldn't believe that Andy was the one that did this.
Charles Andrew Williams, and you go by Andy?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What brought you to California?
My dad, because he got a job out here.
We came from Brunswick, Maryland, back east. He was going from small town, small schools, to like 1,200 kids were going to Santee High, which is, that was a big jump. To me, Andy didn't have much of a change in his attitude, but he's going through the teenager years. So, I'm taking part of that as the, here we go, this 14 years old, here comes the rebellious type part.
Where's Mom?
In South Carolina.
And have your parents been split up long? Or
Mm-hmm.
When's the last time you saw your mom?
Christmas.
But apparently, he had asked his mom during Christmas 2000, because of the troubles that he was having going to Santana High School, to go and move in with her. But I found this out after the shooting later in the summer. And so, it looks like it was just, all this stuff just boiled up inside of him. It was not a very nice place there at Santee High School. He was tired of being bullied and picked on, his skateboards being stolen, backpacks being taken, flushing down the toilets, being burnt with the lighters. Come up and, you have a lighter, you heat it up, take the lighter, put it in the back of their neck.
His own friends used to pick on him. If he had cigarettes, they'd push him around and take his cigarettes from him or whatever. I never really saw anybody else picking on him as far as that goes. I think he tried to make a statement to his friends.
Who's your friends?
Josh is my friend, and I got a couple of friends at school.
You can, Josh. I think you're just a big wuss.
You kick it, bitch.
You kick it, bitch.
Fuck you.
Fuck you.
Josh and AJ probably were the ones that did a lot of the picking on, but there were other kids there at the school that did the same thing. But Andy wanted the friendship of Josh and AJ enough that he was willing to put up with that. He had picked the wrong friends, but you gotta let him pick your own friends.
They were supposed to all go in on the shooting. They came up with this idea to do a Columbine.
You talked to Josh about this?
Mm-hmm.
When did you talk to him?
Like, over the weekend.
What'd you tell him?
I just told him that I was thinking about it, and he was like, oh, you shouldn't do that.
He was gonna come to school and shoot people, and he had it all planned out and stuff, but at the end of the weekend, he said he was just joking.
It is often the case that school shooters tell other people what they're going to do and involve them in a sense, usually in a fantasy sense. It's not clear that these groups are involved in any meaningful, planful way, though the shooter may think they are. And oftentimes the police will attempt to bring conspiracy charges, and usually those charges fall apart for lack of evidence. One thing that seems clear to me as a researcher is that those groups, whether they're goth or not, know that this is a vulnerable person whose buttons they can push. And there is a dynamic inside that group that eggs the shooter on. I suspect that the group itself does not realize how close to the real thing this is going to come. It starts off as a fantasy and a game and ends up in a terrible tragedy.
Who'd you shoot first?
Brian?
He was 14, turning 15. He's a regular kid, you know. He's happy and smiling all the time. Very active kind of kid. He had a lot of friends. Andy was in one of the stalls. Brian was at the mirror. His back was to Andy. And Andy just got out and shot the first person he saw. And Brian probably didn't even know it happened.
And Trevor just stood there and I shot him. And he fell on the ground and asked me why. And I told him to shut up, and the other couple people ran out.
How many times did you shoot Trevor?
Just once.
Bone grew around my bullet and locked it into place, pretty much. So I have limited mobility in my neck.
Then what happened?
I ran to the door and there's a bunch of people just standing there. So I shot out and I shot until the gun was empty, and then I reloaded it.
Andy Williams looks small in his prison garb as his attorneys urge the judge not to try the 15-year-old as an adult, as required by California's tough new law, Proposition 21, calling it cruel, unusual, and unconstitutional.
Yeah, I think I freaking pulled a muscle in my stomach.
That's what shocked people so much about the Andy Williams shooting, I think, was that you couldn't demonize him easily. He looked like a very familiar-looking, kind of nerdy, bullied kid. I think he kind of pulled people's heartstrings, and they understood right away this kid has clearly been pushed to a point. And you had, after that shooting, waves of sympathy threats, even a few shootings, and then all of a sudden all kinds of editorials from people who got out of high school and were in college all across the country talking about their experiences, which were very similar to his, and how they were bullied, how the school culture pushed them beyond the limit, and they were lucky to survive it and get into college. I think that sympathy for these shooters is something that needs to be explored a lot more, and I tried to explore it some myself, but I think, you know, that's something that no one really wants to look at still.
This next song is a Christmas song about Satan. That's right, a Christmas song about Satan.
I didn't know that.
He's around even at Christmas.
A lot of people really enjoy Henderson because it does have a small town feel. For the most part, it's a bedroom community. It does have its own industries and it does have its own businesses, so it is a thriving community in that respect.
County EMS South and Station 4 need you to respond to Atlantis Plastic. We're getting them on the way. Do you know who did it?
Well, I don't know who done it, but I think the guy named Neil, he shot another guy and then shot himself.
Okay.
We heard the boom. Neil come back in the break room with a gun, and he started talking to me one day in the break room about his dad. He talked about his dad having heart problems, and he died. And he said he had heart problems, and he was probably not going to live, probably about 30, I think he said. And he seemed all right at that time. But, I mean, I thought my feelings may have been wrong about him. But as the longer he worked there, the more he showed what he was really like.
Neil was my cousin, and when he was little, we'd go riding around. I just took him places, you know. He was a good kid. We just kind of grew up around each other. He was more like a brother than he was a cousin.
He would just have rages. There was something he wanted in the refrigerator and we didn't have it, so he about knocked the door off. He broke all the shelves and all the jars fell out. All this sauce and stuff, and he said, "You better get in there and clean that up." He picked me up by my throat, my neck, held me up off the floor.
He got to where he would just give you an evil stare. He was tall, he had them black eyes, and he just put his mouth together and he just looked at you real. He just had an evil stare about him.
Lo que encontré atractivo de él es que era un muy buen hombre, muy buen trabajador, pues, muy buena persona conmigo. Pues él me dijo que tuvo un accidente cuando tuvo 14 años y por eso se quebró el hueso de sus pies.
He was involved in a car accident and he spent 42 days in the hospital. He broke 3 bones in his right leg, broke his wrist, cut his neck. And after he got out of the hospital, he had surgery on his leg about 5 times.
Sí, a él le gustaban mucho las drogas, le gustaba tomar bastantes pastillas para el dolor, pero no solamente tomaba una, sino que muchas.
And I don't think it ever stopped hurting him, his leg.
Day of the shooting, when I saw him and Kevin together, they were arguing and he was mad. They come storming through the break room, Kevin and Neil, and they went out in the back. Then we was sitting in there, and then all of a sudden we heard a pow.
Yeah, Kevin was my cousin too, and him and Neil, they were pretty good friends as far as I know. Kevin's my cousin on my dad's side, and Neil is my cousin on my mom's side. But then Kevin, he'd get a little smart, and Neil'd get a little smart. I guess they had their moments, but I never dreamed that anything like that would happen.
He went around outside through another entrance and come back around and shot Joshua, which we didn't even hear that shot. I don't know why we didn't hear it.
He come from either the break room area or our assembly area.
Okay.
He come just up from behind him from that area.
Okay, so Neil's getting close to you?
To Joshua. And they got really close to me. Like I said, I was turning around. By the time I was turning back around, I heard the really loud bang, and Joshua fell, and I seen Neil with the gun. He was staring at me, and so I was getting ready to dive for the floor myself, and then he took off running.
De repente veía a Neil que venía entrando sobre la cocina y vimos que sacó el arma y empezó a disparar. Primero yo estaba sentado en la primera mesa y él trató de dispararme, pero yo me aventé de una mesa a la otra y aventé la silla, la mesa, y empezó a dispararle a mis compañeros que estaban de frente.
I saw blood, and then Tricia and Rachel got up. They tried to run, started shooting them, both in the head.
Él se agarró disparando como una persona que estaba ida de mente. Él no sabía qué es lo que hacía.
Pues yo pienso que lo que el niño tenía adentro, siempre la tristeza, no teníamos dinero, no teníamos cómo pagar la renta, todo nos faltaba, entonces yo pienso que es por eso él tomó demasiada pastilla y se mató.
Kevin said he thought he could control Neil, but he found out he couldn't. It's one of the things that may have got Neil mad, because I think he was trying to control Neil that night. Kevin started putting his foot down, I believe, because he was telling him to wear his glasses, don't talk on the phone, And Neil it just got Neil madder and madder, and I guess Neil showed Kevin, you know, he's not going to control me.
Pues solamente que lo siento mucho por los niños que se quedaron sin madre. Y yo los entiendo mucho, porque yo tengo a mi hijo y me pregunta por su papá cada rato. Dice, papi, papi. Y yo me siento muy mal por eso, porque su papá no está.
It all goes back to Satan. Satan is the main cause of a lot of what's going on here. And Neil, he wore shirts with devil signs on it. He talked about the devil. He said he'd like to meet Satan.
Responding, think we have at least 6 down, possibly we have some still breathing.
Another town, another campus, another classroom. This time, it was a 27-year-old graduate student who carried his weapons in a guitar case.
On February 14th on stage, Steve dressed all in black with a t-shirt that had a red AK-47 on it and white lettering that said terrorist.
The first day I met him, I thought he was gorgeous.
He tried to commit suicide 6 times.
I met Steven at Northern Illinois University. He was in a lot of my criminology classes.
Then came the horrendous sounds of shooting, of screams, of fear that will always haunt them. And finally, one last shot as the killer killed himself.
It's something related to the military training that Steve received that enabled him to kill without any psychological or emotional effect. The military is a consistent presence in most school shooters. It seems to make sense because the military trains you to kill without any psychological or emotional response.
When I met him, he had just recently gotten out of the Army, and he was still trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life.
He told me that he had to leave because he didn't disclose all of his mental health information. He really liked the Army. He liked the structure. It just fit for him. He was very structured and punctual and liked things a certain way.
Primarily, he was someone who was not very functional, who had consistent, ongoing, terrible mental health problems that made it difficult for him to just get through the day. And so structured environments were what made him feel secure. In doing this final act of the shooting, I think that it was important that it was at Cole Hall, which was in view of the sociology department. His professors could look out their window and look down almost as if it was staged.
It was getting to about 3 o'clock. The professor was starting to close his lecture, and at about 3:05, the side exit stage door opened up.
I look up and I see a man, face dead of emotion, holding a large shotgun.
He didn't say anything. He just walked on stage, pointed at his gun, and started shooting.
And he proceeded to then fire into the first set of rows.
His shotgun was for shock and awe and effect, and he used birdshot, so it didn't kill anybody. It was just part of his, wanting to have kind of a powerful entrance, I think. I think it was theatrical.
There is a dimension of theater in these shootings because what the shooter is trying to do is attack the public, not just the people who are getting shot. They're trying to attack the most sacred spaces in a community, a school that everybody goes to, a workplace that many people visit. If all they were trying to do was kill a few people or kill themselves, they could sneak off to some quiet corner and do that. They choose these public stages because there is an element of rage at an entire society that is at issue there. And the element of theater is driven by wanting other people, peers in your social group, to see you as tough, as cool, not just as somebody who's managed to shoot a few people.
I saw him walk across the stage and pull out a pistol
He came down off the stage and ran up the aisle and just shooting as he went. Our daughter was sitting maybe 5 or 6 rows back from the front, right
in the middle.
On the aisle that he came down.
The coroner assured us that she was unconscious from the moment it entered her head and went through, so she didn't feel anything, and that gave us great comfort.
Beautiful, beautiful Zion, we're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God.
I was looking initially at Steve Kazmierczak's story as a suicide and trying to understand it through that lens rather than trying to understand him simply as a murderer. And it opened up the story in ways that were different than other media approaches. The big breakthrough was going bowling one night with the other graduate students in sociology at NIU that had been Steve's friends. And one of them said, "Hey, I have this cousin who went to high school with Steve."
We were always really good friends. We understood each other. We were in a club together called Free Your Mind. We were a bunch of misfits. We weren't like the normal pop culture kids. We were like outcast youth, kind of. We were like pissed off at the world and we're gonna rebel against everything, and wore all black and black eyeliner and listened to Marilyn Manson, and it was kind of gothic. We were sitting in the foyer at school and he was just minding his own business, reading a book, and a group of jocks, football players, came out and started laughing and came up and flicked him in the ear, and he goes, "Leave me alone." And then the other kid knocked his book out of his hands and said, "Watch out, or Suicide Steve might go off himself." People made fun of him for all sorts of things because he was, a band geek, basically. He played in the marching band and he was always the best student in class. If he got a bad grade, he was so hard on himself, and he was very angry. His parents did not give him the love and support he really needed, and I really think that they just popped him full as much pills as possible to keep him, at an even keel. You would look into his eyes and it was glazed over because of all the drugs he was on.
Kazmierczak transferred to the University of Illinois Champaign, about 170 miles away. People who knew him said he'd recently quit taking some kind of medication and was increasingly erratic.
In the search for clues to his recent state of mind, there are these tattoos showing gruesome blood-splattered scenes from horror movies. He got them in the past 6 months.
One of his T-shirts has the Nietzschean quote, "Careful lest you look into the abyss because it's looking back at you."
Nietzsche has been used and interpreted various ways, but his book that Steve really liked was The Antichrist, and he felt a personal bond to it. Every single line is an incitement to murder, to genocide. It puts the individual above any social concern. That someone who wants to take power, who has the audacity to do that, is free of ethics, free of morality, and can slaughter at will, and that's somehow good. And it's an outrageous book, and he had underlined passages, had gone over and over it, had found a kind of justification in it, I think.
Once again, a community in the United States is trying to figure out how, and more importantly, why.
I think primarily it's a crime of a broken person. But I think that it is possible also to understand the shootings as made possible by a combination of ideas that seem to me to fit particularly well in America, that seem to be part of who America is. And so I think that it's dangerous to dismiss Steve Kazmierczak as being just a lone freak. I think that he's in some ways a representation of American culture. Because that idea of the individual, ideas that fit with Nietzsche, the Superman above moral code, the idea of the vigilante, the idea of the Western hero who comes to town and asserts his will and his law over the group, oftentimes it's viewed as being in the cause of good, but it's not necessary for it to be in the cause of good. I mean, that's one thing that's frightening about it. And also, the idea of the good is something that can be easily twisted.
It was just like he wanted to prove a point, maybe. I'm not saying that he was not, that what he did was not wrong. It's very wrong. And, you know, God, he's facing his maker, you know? He's gonna have to face all the sins of his past, and I just pray that, you know, he's in a better place as well as all the other people, because when he was here on earth, he was not in a good place.
God is justice, God is love, God is reigning from above, God is sovereign o'er the land, nations bow at his command.
And he was facing 450 years to life to go to a jury trial. So the judge made the agreement, okay, plead guilty to these, we'll run them concurrently. So that's where his 50 years to life comes in. And so Andy, you know, decided, well, okay, well, 50 life sounds better than 450 years. So he's eligible for parole when he's 65 years old.
You want to see it?
Okay.
That's what happens when a little bullet hits you. Just touched it, and it blew the skin all to pieces.
My daughter's just a miracle that we never expected, because much to my doctor's chagrin, one of the first questions I asked after being explained that, you know, I was paralyzed and what had happened and what my life was going to entail, my first question was, will I be able to have more children? So she was a miracle.
January the 25th of 07, I found out that I was pregnant. And one thing that I did notice that I was kind of sad about, though, was that I couldn't feel the baby inside my stomach. I couldn't feel that feeling, but I could see the baby moving.
I miss some people. I miss talking to them, and so I never forget it. It's always there.
He sent me a lot of stuff that I received in the mail, like, for weeks after the shooting. He sent me earrings, he sent me a purse, he sent me a wedding ring. Part of me will always be with Stephen.
It definitely was a life-defining moment, I think, but it doesn't define who I am, because I think me as a person is more than just December 1st, 1997. There's a lot more of me than just that day, so.
Det har gått nästan 100 år. Men bilderna finns kvar. Och det fantastiska svartvita ljuset.
Inga kan föra oss tillbaka i tiden som Olle Häger och Hans Villius.
Det var en gång ett land av gärdsgårdar och grindar. Där ungarna sprang barfota längs bygatan. Och bensin var något man köpte på apotek.
Följ hur det moderna Sverige skapades i 100 svenska år. Måndagar i 2:an.
En biljettkassör från Dramaten i Stockholm, en skadereglerare och en bowlingfantast med 268 som bästa serie. Ja, det är en salig blandning av allmänbildade deltagare som sätts på prov i Vem vet mest om 5 minuter efter nyheterna på samiska.